Welcome back. I've lost track of the numbers. This is number 7, number 8, number 6. We've done a bunch. Last week we had an exercise that Shana led, where we were all given stickies, and Shana established organizations, both known and unknown, and had us take attributes of what we learned about Ellicott City, the watershed, and the challenges we face, and assign them to the different entities that were defined. And she summarizes in a sort of 2-pager, which is a piece of paper, if you don't all have it. I think it was distributed earlier today. And it's all categorized. And these are the sort of unedited findings of the group. And this was a very informal discussion. We talked about government, the Economic Development Authority, the Ellicott City Partnership, combinations thereof, all the entities, the Historic Society, which might include mixed group to some extent, and then another bucket that we just called unmet, unknown things. And we put things in that bucket that didn't seem to fit in the other buckets as we defined them. And it was a good exercise. Of course, not everybody here tonight was here last week, but I think with a sign of good faith that no one was trying to preordain any discussion at this point tonight. But it was a very good group discussion in terms of where we all thought consensus-wise things should fall in various buckets. And this is the summary. Shane, thank you for pulling it together on all the other things you've been busy with. To start off discussions tonight. A long day, probably a long couple days, Matt.
Yes, indeed.
Long couple days.
Yeah, and maybe Shane, if you want to we could take a step back a little bit. Maybe I should have opened with this, but there was a press conference today. The county executive did address the flooding sort of mitigation strategies that are being pursued. And maybe we could just take a moment and, because not all of us were there, just maybe tell us all a little bit about what played out today and decisions that are made in the process going forward relative to that side of the equation.
Well, thanks to those of you who were able to make it today. County Executive announced a lot of things, so I would encourage you to go look on the EC Safe and Sound website, which is ecsafeandsound.org. Lots of information there, lots of FAQs. Obviously, if you have any questions about anything that you see there, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions that I know the answers to or track down information that I don't have. But basically, County Executive announced 5 plans for flood mitigation that he's looking for comment on. A decision will be made mid-May after the meeting at the beginning of May. He laid out kind of what was happening with the buildings, which most likely scenario is that 4 buildings will be demolished, 6 will be kept. Those buildings will be renovated by the county. The county will hold them until the flood mitigation projects are complete. We announced some high ground access points, which are just ways to get out of the floodplain when there's an event that you need to exit the floodplain for. Then we also announced that the master planning process would be restarting and that we are launching a capital projects tracker. So lots of information.
What's the tracker?
It's just showing the stages of capital projects as they're kind of going through the process.
Any questions about today? Some I guess were there, so maybe you have a better sense of what played out. Any questions?
I have a question about the master plan. Restart, what does that mean?
It means that the plan is they're gonna start the process again that's been paused since the election.
So, what's the base? Are you starting with the plan, except modify Main Street?
Yeah.
And if the 4 buildings go away, it sounds like all scenarios have the 4 buildings being removed, is that right? As a sort of a base case. A premise that I've been sort of leading myself by, and perhaps others in this group, that those buildings would be part of the asset base that would be part of the organization's mission. And I don't know if that's been thought through in terms of what it might mean relative to mission. If in fact we elect to create an organization, what has some thought been given to that in terms of whether the entity, if we have to create an entity, has a mission relative to the result of the decisions that have been reached based on it. You can address that, Shana, or not? But I'm curious.
I guess I don't understand. So there's 6 buildings that will need to be dealt with.
6.
So,
not 10.
Right.
6.
So we never committed to keeping 10 buildings. We said that we wanted to keep as many buildings as possible. That's what we've been saying over and over and over again for the past 4.5 months. And the most likely scenario is that we'll be able to keep 6. So I don't know if we ever thought we'd be able to keep 10. I don't know if anyone thought we'd be able to keep all 10. But we have 6 buildings that are going to be very usable. The Shoemakers building, for example, we're only demolishing the first floor in the back. So it'll have a full second and third floor. That building's huge. So there's lots of opportunity in those buildings once we get through the process of being able to demo the backs of them.
And before they go away, I think privately, we talked about this a few minutes before the group convened, but they're largely going away because of the infrastructure that's built below them.
Mhm.
As you explained to me, it's impossible for structural reasons, perhaps for safety reasons, I'm not sure, but to keep buildings or some use above them in the event maintenance has to happen presumably or some other thing.
I really don't know all of the mechanics of it, but I'm told that we don't want structures on top of the culverts once you've removed them in order to build the culverts.
The culverts would run toward the train station, I didn't see the plan.
Yeah, underneath Maryland Avenue.
Go under Maryland Avenue.
To the
They pour
river.
it Either side of the train station, or they pour it on one side, and there's a little culvert inlet right there, outlet I should say rather, turns into an inlet when things are overwhelmed, but is that where the water would be deposited in that little piece of outlet that is right adjacent to Main Street? Or would they
I'm not-
flange on?
Under Maryland Avenue.
Right,
Yeah.
It kind of
that-
It's the
goes
river,
like-
I guess. from-
This
Yeah.
is a really poor picture.
Oh.
Current,
Yeah,
this will be an addition.
okay. So
This
there's-
would be like the V&L, right?
Mm.
Right, okay.
So it goes
Under
So
Maryland
this-
Ave,
this
under
is
the train
what-
track.
under the train station.
Yeah. so
It's
this is what
connecting the
exists.
stream to the river.
And also, Mike, they're
Does.
Sorry, Tom.
not just because of what's going on underneath it, but it's also because a lot of the improvements that are happening upstream are to get the channel more of the water to get it through town as fast as possible. And that means there needs to be additional room for the water at the bottom of the hill. And so those 4 buildings, if you go down Main Street, those 4 buildings are the ones that sit on top of the water, whereas many of the other buildings, particularly the 6 that are being preserved, have facades that do not go over the water, particularly the Shoemaker building, where over time, if you sort of look at the building footprint, they were put over the water, whereas they weren't necessarily built originally over the water.
And we've had structural plans drawn up and measurements and everything done of the insides of the building so that we could have a sense of how much space we have to work with, because we wanted to make sure that we weren't keeping buildings that there wouldn't be any usable space inside. And all of the buildings will still have usable space once the backs are taken off. And again, Shoemakers has a full second and third floor after the partial demolition.
So in the footprint of the 4 buildings that go away, if I'm walking down Main Street, what do I see it, Greg? Is it just an open green space, or is it a pond, or is it a
That's
retention
something for the
device?
master planning process to,
It's not defined.
that's part of what the master plan will, they're the ones who came up with the renderings when the 10 buildings were going to
It's a
be
channel.
taken down, so.
Is it open to the air?
Mhm.
It is, okay. I heard culvert. Culvert to me is covered.
It's
tunnel.
cut-
It's
Three
covered.
sides.
Yeah, but it's open on top.
I don't know that this is the proper place to bring this up, but if the
Oh,
additional
anything
tunnel,
you have to say it's
if
proper.
the additional tunnel is going under the turntable area, which was discussed before, there's already a sinkhole issue in that turntable area that I think needs to be addressed before anything else is done. I've mentioned it to Mark DeLuca, but there is a sinkhole issue in that turntable area consistently that's being filled in, and then it washes out again. So there's some sort of an issue that's happening there that probably needs to be addressed before anything else goes in.
So, something that you Calvin announced this today, that I guess that's going to be starting on June 1st.
Well, officially, it'll kick off, and then we have
You
kind
mean
of a
the
rough
master plan?
timeline.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I guess it begs the question, what are we doing? Because the master plan calls for this organization to eventually exist. And just based on the plans that were proposed today, we're looking at maybe 4 to 6 years of mitigation. So is it 4 to 6 years that the buildings are restored as facades that people can walk by and the town is more beautiful than it is now? And then nothing will be done with those
No,
structures?
we're
or-
renovating the
right?
buildings.
No, I
we're-
understand that, but.
And they're going to be public use buildings. So we need, whatever, if this organization existed, they could help kind of determine what that public use is. So the buildings are going to be buildings that things are in. We don't know what's going to be in them yet, but we're going to renovate them once we get through the Section 106 process, and they're going to be whatever they are, a space for pop-ups, office space, a place for, I mean, whatever. It's going to be usable space. It's just that the county is going to own it so that they can control occupancy.
Right, so I just want clarification because you just said that you guys won't be doing anything until the upstream mitigation is completed.
No,
So I'm
you
trying to
misunderstood.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand that.
No, the only thing that's preventing us from, like, right now today, besides money, renovating the buildings, is that we need to go through a Section 106 process, which is not mitigation. It's a federal 106 process to do the back demolitions on the buildings. As soon as those are done, we're gonna renovate all the buildings, like bring them all the way up so that they're like good usable buildings, and then they're gonna be a public use. So we don't know what's gonna go inside of them, but something is going to be inside of them so that they are like usable buildings.
I'm with you, but as we discussed previously, that Section 106 could take up to a year, and then it's removal, and then it's renovations, and so maybe we're looking at like 18 to 20 months down the road to have a functional building. So I guess it still begs the question, what is this organization or this committee at this time doing to move forward if the master plan is getting reenacted and calls for something like this already, and then technically we have no property to manage for at least 20 months? That's what I don't...
May I see where you're going? I think what I'm hearing you say is that a CDC could either be the managing entity or could manage in partnership, or perhaps even could be Howard County could transfer. I mean, there's a variety of different options that could be on the table if the CDC existed, and they probably would be a better long-term managing party, I would say party, than the county itself.
Well, because
Right, 'cause there's no, like,
doesn't
office
want to
of-
be in the business of owning.
Correct.
Right, and there's like no
property
office of
rented out.
renovation,
Right.
you know,
And
Howard County.
It could be
No
in the
matter how much
process
you might
of
want.
looking to address those issues.
And I think there are more examples
From
out
the start.
there of government doing a pretty poor job of managing commercial real estate, and there are good examples. And maybe this is a vehicle. You know, I was a little dismayed when I heard about the event today, personally, because I thought it felt like the decision's been made. We're raising the buildings. We're going to be placing other buildings in government control, ownership. I was losing sight this afternoon of what a CDC could do, or what an entity could do, what role it could play. Because the asset base seemed to be prescribed, you know, between demolition, which takes away any development opportunity, and then putting other buildings just in the government's control for the period of time it takes to get them reoccupied. And I prefer to see something more energetic than, you know, repossessing them and repurposing them without a real plan, without a real vision for what they could be. You know, I'd like to see that vibrant thing happen as you would, does this owner property owner on Main Street. You don't want to have a hole in the donut.
Just as a resident of Howard County, like,
Right, but
I often
don't-
try to put myself in a place of like people that don't live in this district, like, is the town equally as valuable to them? And why not? Is it because we're not doing a good enough job of communicating that value? Or like, if this was happening in another district and I was at the table, I would want those people to feel like I'm equally as invested in making a difference in their community. So whether you have a business or had your first date, it's like we need to get to a place where we're starting to equate the value. And
Well, excuse me for saying it the way I did.
no, it's totally
All right.
okay. I think but I think that
I don't mean to
think
say
it's
you only look at it
unfair.
from one lens.
No.
But it's the same lens we're all looking at.
Right,
it from,
exactly.
right?
That's
That's it.
we're on board
And
together.
so-
But the county executive is taking our council in addition to council from DPW. And so I think that the Department of Public Works has done evaluations and models that has resulted in much of the announcement that came forward today. And I think that the CDC and what its function would be, you know, I agree, it would be part of the master plan, but what we're doing would seem to be a deeper dive on that rather than just there should be a CDC. It's more, we're focusing in detail on what that function would be.
Also, I think it's important to point out that, like, this group was never created to determine if the buildings would stay up or not. That's a public safety flood mitigation issue. So that was never the intended role here. The county executive was always going to be the decision maker about what buildings stayed and what buildings went. the role of this group is, okay, so we have most likely 6 buildings. Okay, so that's the beginning of an asset base. Is there a group that could manage that, and what would that group look like? So I don't really think that today's announcement changed anything. I mean, it gave more detail, but I don't think it changed anything in terms of the function of what a CDC would be.
Shannon, has the cost of this mitigation process been determined? And if so, has it been determined where the funding will come from?
All of the options have a price tag associated with them. Obviously, we would be looking to state and federal partners to help, but you know, in the end, I mean, it's a county plan, and the county has to be prepared to fund it.
There's a really helpful like chart that they put out that sort of identifies different projects and components to each option and the price tag.
Yeah, because the thought is that, you know, if this is an expensive process, then maybe the county should control, operate, and manage the buildings until that process is completed. And then if there is a CDC created, the assets can be transferred to the CDC post-renovation, or at least post-mitigation.
But I mean, I think a CDC could also help determine, okay, we have, let's say, 5 years worth of public use in these buildings. Well, what's the best public use? How can these buildings best serve the community? You know, just because they're public use doesn't mean they have to be boring or not useful. You know, I mean, they can be owned by the county and still contribute to the overall vitality of the town. And that's something that a CDC could help with.
To me, a CDC has to have an asset base, and I'd like that asset base to be as broad as it possibly can be, so the CDC has a better chance of achieving self-sufficiency. So be it 2 buildings, or 4 buildings, or 6 buildings, or 8 or 10, or 15 or 20. I'm not looking for the CDC to control downtown Ellicott City, trust me, or the watershed, but just the assets that are in need of help. You know, that to me is the challenge, trying to give this entity, if we choose the entity, we need to talk about that tonight, an asset base to work from. So I never thought it was a certain quantity of buildings. I just thought it would have an asset base, and it needs an asset base to work from.
So can I ask, because I think what I heard you say, Shannon, was that the county would still own the buildings, but the CDC would just be sort of essentially guiding their use. And,
I mean,
and their
That's
development.
to be determined, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, all right.
I'm just throwing things at, like,
Got it.
It's up.
That's
It's up for
what
grabs.
we're here to talk, you know what I mean? I'm just kind of trying to show that there are opportunities out there.
Right.
I mean, it's up to you all to decide if there is a group that needs to be created and what it would do. So, I mean,
Absolutely, and I totally agree. But presumably it's up to I mean, it clearly will be a county decision at some point to, you know, whether we stood up a CDC or not. At some point, the county executive has to decide to say, oh, and here, 6 buildings, take them, manage them, you know, per your mission statement and all that good stuff. Or not. I mean, right? I mean, it doesn't, I'm trying to understand
there's
how the
two-
process works.
There's I think you may have baked 2 questions in there about whether or not we stand up a CDC or not, whether or not the county executive pushes that forward. I think it is important throughout this whole discussion, and we've never really talked about this, is that Howard County sort of created CDC is one way of doing this, and the county executive giving it his blessing. There's nothing that prevents anyone and any group of people coming together to create a CDC. So it doesn't just have to be so. Even if perhaps County Executive Ball decided it was a bad idea, we all decided it was a bad idea, that wouldn't prevent somebody else from doing it. But I do think you're right in terms of there would have to be discussion then, okay, you stood this thing up, do we want to, you know, dispose of property and
Right.
sell it to them for $1? Do
Right.
we give them a 100-year lease so that they can take advantage of tax credits to do the work that needs to be done? I mean, I feel like all of those things would then be on the table once the decision was made or the recommendation was pushed forward that we want to do a CDC, but it needs to be under these terms, or we think
Yeah.
it would, you know, be best if it had blank, blank, blank.
Right. And to your, right. I'm trying to digest multiple threads. It's been a long day for everybody. Not like Shane has had a long day. Anyway, forget it. I'll come back to it.
Part of what, you know, distracted Shana from all the important things that played out today was my ask from last week to sort of summarize and put these things sort of on a piece of paper that we spent a lot of time last week identifying and in these different buckets. And the big takeaway I had from last week for those that were there, the overwhelming majority of things, issues, items, identified needs, fell in the other bucket. And The other things fell into the government buckets that typically would fall in the government realm, infrastructure, construction, public safety, life safety, if you will. And I think, they're captured here pretty readily. Some grants and other things, communication roles, but largely the things you expect government to do. And then the EDA was sort of identified with investors, funding to start and expand businesses, pretty limited, perhaps some overlap with ECP on diversity, promotional events, getting money from merchant cooperative advertising or other things that encourage more people to visit the district in the watershed area. And then there were a bucket of things, and Matt, we didn't have the benefit of your presence last week, but we tried to do as good a job as we could identifying things that fall in the ECP's realm. And then things that seem to go everywhere, expertise, publicity, certainty. I mean, just the challenge of trying to address the things that we're trying to address in the district. A little bit on the Maryland Historic Society, and then a long list, and they're not in any order, and none of these are, but just all the things that didn't fall into any of the above buckets. And I'd just like to talk about whether how people feel about the process we went through last week. And you shared an email, I don't know if it went to everybody, but a desire perhaps to rank things. I want to talk about that, what's doable, what's not doable on these lists. But I'd like to reach a conclusion tonight, if it's feasible, in the next hour-ish of time, about whether we feel comfortable making a recommendation at this point, and then using next week and maybe the week after to sort of better define what the recommendation is, if in fact we all agree. Or maybe we can't all agree, but the majority agrees that something other than what we have is needed. And that frankly is a conclusion I reached last week without really asking for a straw vote of those present. We don't operate by the Roberts rules with this group, so I don't know that we have a quorum responsibility or 100% participation responsibility. It's a sense of, and it's a sense of those who can make it and participate. And I know we have challenges, all of us do, in terms of our times and schedules and families and responsibilities. I really appreciate the effort everybody's been putting forward thus far. But I wanted to see if we could start moving towards some conclusionary statements about this discussion, because Wednesday nights are valuable to all, and there are many other things we'd like to do Wednesday nights, I'm sure. But I just want to set a tone tonight and see if we can't reach a conclusion about whether that other thing is something we need on the basis of what we all discussed, and I'd just like to open up for discussion. So please.
When you look at the long list here for unmet needs, it tells you something is missing here. So, I think by this alone is evident that all the needs are being met. And I would imagine that these don't represent all the needs that we just haven't even discussed or just aren't aware of. So something's missing, and there has to be some entity or entities to find a way to meet those needs. That's my position on that.
I think it's, there's a need, and it's linked to the master plan. If you don't have a plan, what's the point of an organization? So I'm just drawing that connection. The master plan is important.
Because I was thinking on the same line with Gary, is that the one unmet need is if there is a CDC, there would have to be some kind of connection with that planning process, which I guess is a little bit, or it needs to go hand in hand with that.
Well, it feels like today decisions were made about the direction in terms of infrastructure improvement, and the commitment was made today to re-engage the planning process. So those are good steps in their lane, and that's important. And we get to step up now and address this issue, which the county executive did mention in his remarks, that this group is still doing its thing, and I think he's eagerly awaiting the findings of our work.
So, my thoughts / questions are along this line. So you mentioned that you felt like, that you felt like the, supposed to be muted, that a CDC would have to be asset-based. So you're looking for some type of ownership of real estate, maybe.
Could be a leasehold interest that has many forms.
Okay, fair enough.
Many forms.
So with regard to when the ED of the sort of the collective of CDCs came to speak with us. I can't remember her name.
Odette.
Thank you. When Odette came and spoke with us, she mentioned the difference between the CDC and the CDO. Do you still see us leaning towards the CDC under the premise of what HUD says we need to do, or are we going to go in the CDO direction? And is that, which of those organizations are we talking about? And the last piece, speaking to the connection with the master plan, is it possible for an organization, as Nick so eloquently put it, anybody can start it if they felt like it, you know what I mean? For us to come up with some sort of a business plan, or at least mission or vision statement for this organization or entity that would be able to have a seat at the table in the discussion of the development of the master plan when it reopens.
In terms of the CDC versus the other versions, I think that's an open discussion point. And I think we should maybe not be too prescriptive in terms of which path, but say there are alternatives that the county executive could consider and the county council could consider as they look at different mechanisms. There are probably strengths and weaknesses greater than what we've already understood, because we only spent 15, 20 minutes talking about the distinctions between the two entities. And Nick may have more experience to share with us.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, the HUD recognized CDC, from what I understand and from having heard it again from Odette, is that there's not a whole lot to gain from that process. And that you're still eligible for the vast majority of federal and state grant fundings if you're a CDO. And I think the vast majority of community development organizations have moved away from the CDC title because it does sound a little corporate, and they want to talk about the big more organizations. So I think some of it is slightly semantics, and then I think those who want to specifically be CDCs, could for that specific HUD program could still go down that road. And I would also say that if we do make a decision. And I also agree, kind of based on the unmet needs and everything we've heard over these weeks, that a CDO play a critical role here in Ellicott City, particularly based on some of the decisions that have been made today, and firming up the fact that there is now public ownership. We knew it was in the works, but now we know it's official. But if we go down that road, it might be good for us to re-engage with Odette again, even if it were, if we were to go and ask for a little bit of support to get Odette back in, even just in a, I don't know if that would be before we make the recommendation, or maybe part of the recommendation is to bring Odette in to help to establish this, but I think she's going to be better equipped to answer some of those very specific questions that I'm not sure it's worth us getting into the weeds of some of that stuff. Yeah, and there's going to need to be a lot of expertise to actually stand this thing up. But I think that's a separate part of the decision. But I do think that Odette is a good resource that we shouldn't miss. And it was great that we had her come out.
And I guess just like on the surface, what I'm thinking is that if we're looking for an organization that's going to represent the interests of Ellicott City and all of what that entails and what we're talking about, that for a master plan to be completely developed without the participation of this organization seems a little,
It won't work.
right.
I mean, I think Beth hit it, a month ago, 5 weeks ago, when she came in and said, gee, who would run this thing? Who would be part of it? And I felt like saying, you. You are exactly the level, the type of person who should sit on the board and have a role from a community perspective. And to me, economic, the partnership, all these entities should play a role in its creation. And this organization doesn't usurp any of the others. It cooperates, coordinates, doesn't control. It doesn't say, I'm here to save, Ellicott City. God forbid that. It's here to say, I want to work with the resources that have been identified. They're all doing great work. I want to bring them together, and I want to elevate the game. I want to bring professionals in who know how to do the things that Nick just talked about in terms of the grant making and place-making skill sets that are so critical to helping us, out of this abyss. And then partner with Shana and take some of the burden off of her so that it's not just Shana's job to come up with the phone call boards and everything that explains everything all the time. But we have a group of people who are aligned with county government and the vision. you know, maybe I'm too utopian in the way I'm looking at this, but to me, that's the direction.
It's okay to want the magical unicorn.
Yeah, it's okay. Maybe it is a dream only, I don't know, what do you think?
It's never a problem to aim for utopia.
It isn't. A lot of people have tried, you know, we haven't found it yet.
Can I ask a couple of quick questions?
Good.
So, and they're, you know, apologies for missing last week. And,
It's okay.
Some life
We're
and
not
kids.
keeping attendance that way.
Sure. No, well, but the unfortunate thing is I'm going to, ask you a question, and you're like, oh, well, if you were only here.
No, I don't think that's a fair answer.
Okay, over the last couple, however many months, I guess at this point, we've had, you know, a journey sort of around CDC/Os that do multiple things. But what I'm hearing now, and I'm not saying it doesn't make sense at all, I'm saying it does make sense, but what I'm hearing now I think is more of a narrower version, which I think you've been really supportive of, Mike, of this. It's really about managing property. Perhaps it's about some other, you know, and some development aspects, but I don't hear some of the other things that have been raised that some other CDCs/CDOs, you know, with more social missions or jobs. I haven't heard, thus far in this conversation, I've heard it really be about these 4 to 6 buildings, depending on whether those two get, and sort of redeveloping those and the use that, you know, let's make them cool and all that stuff that Shane said that I totally agree with. That's what I'm hearing. Is that, have we sort of focused a little bit on that?
That's what I think so.
I don't think so.
No.
Okay.
I think that's
I
the core,
think-
I think that's the core, the initial core, you know, of basically the business, like that ultimately will kind of be the bread and butter or the core daily sort of the place to start. But I think what I heard you say is that you want to see the CDC as a convener, as a group that pulls all partners together to elevate, you know, to add jobs to the, you know, to stimulate the economy, which will benefit social thing, you know, which will benefit the less than.
Affordable housing can be part of the
Yeah,
solution.
like, it's,
I think it should be left up to the group, the organization to figure out what its real mission is. We can provide some guidelines, but I wouldn't want to be too prescriptive. You know?
I do think, though, that the reason we're probably drawn to, and the reason that it's easiest to understand its role with respect to those 6 buildings is because it's actually concrete. And it's, here's the buildings, here's an issue, here's the exact issue. It's not something so amorphous as affordable housing, which there are clearly issues, and there are prescriptions to those issues that could be employed, but they're harder to understand when we don't have a specific project in front of us and say, well, this is something you can work on. So
Yeah.
I do think that it might be useful to use these as examples of the kind of things that it could be doing.
Yeah, I
Because
would've
some
come
of
to that in a
this,
second.
It's like
because some of this
program
is
work.
so, it can be
Program work.
squishy until you have a specific project in front of you.
Right.
I also think there's some other big, I mean, we've talked before about the courthouse, about the old Ellicott City Jail. These are projects that may or may not engage the CDC, but
I
we're.
think it should.
I think it, well, but what I was gonna say is.
I was gonna, you know, as part of, sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say,
I'm
no,
sorry.
I don't want to stop any discussion, I think it's good. I was just gonna say that if we're a CDC to be in place, it could be a part of that conversation and very likely would be engaged in those kinds of projects. So there are other concrete things coming down the pike.
But I want to be clear on that point, Shane. I think
He was
help us
actually
all.
mid-point
Oh, I'm
too.
sorry.
so-
Yeah, I got it. But I don't wanna-
Call it back, sorry.
Do we have the executive order? I mean, I just feel like we've heard so many, like, what does the executive order say that the mission here is? You know, the CDC.
I'd have to find it. I don't have it on hand. Yeah,
Someone have it?
it's online.
Is it on? I look for it online.
Hmm?
Is it's on the website?
All right.
I'll send them
So what is the process that you think, like, Mike, what do you see the process being?
Sorry, I was looking for the resolution.
Oh,
I
sorry.
don't have it. I'm sorry.
So what do you see the process being? This is like at the
Well,
end.
I think we've been at this for a long time.
Yeah, I feel like-
We've brought in a lot of experts, we've brought in a lot of community people. We've heard from all the different organizations that play a role currently. We've had the benefit of a lot of great people that are super invested in the downtown Ellicott City and the watershed area from a planning perspective, a business perspective. kind of feel like we've gotten to a point, I have, where I'm pretty
Like
clear
a
about
straw
what I
man, like
think
maybe
I want
put
to
some
do.
names on a piece of paper?
Well,
Like a straw
yeah, that would
man.
be the next step beyond
Yeah.
tonight. But tonight, I'd just like to see if there's a consensus. We can, the scope issue can be another level of discussion, you know, whether, you know, what the scope of the entity should be. But do we need an entity? That's kind of where I want to start. If I can conclude tonight with a consensus on that, that's a big step forward, I think. And then we can begin framing relevant resolution and beyond the resolution, because the resolution guides us. I don't know if it prescribes us. So I don't know how it's worded. I really didn't spend a lot of time looking at the guidelines. Maybe Gary, you read it, just, you looked at it just now. I'm not sure if you can address Matt's question. I'm not a lawyer, but I know.
I just wanted to add to the comment, remind ourselves, Ellicott City is rich in resources. We talked about this being an asset-based organization. There's the courthouse, there's several parking lots, there's other real estate that's public within the watershed. And then outside that, there are partnership opportunities that I would hope the organization took initiative to create those partnerships where they wouldn't happen on their own. So I think there's a great need and a great resource there. And if it's not capitalized on, it would be unfortunate.
So what does that say?
That is our agenda, not.
Oh, it isn't?
Executive order.
It's our mission on there.
But I think it's been, what does it say,
So-
Shana? Can you?
I have it right
Yeah, I
here.
can read it.
All right.
To determine the geographic boundaries of the CDC, to develop a mission statement for the CDC.
Well, but there's something.
Well-
Oh, I'm sorry, there's
Yeah.
something before that, yes. Okay, and it'd be further ordered that the duty and the committee shall be to examine the current landscape of organizations and services in Ellicott City to determine if there is a need for a community development corporation. This review will include examining governmental and non-governmental, nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, businesses, etc., to see if there are needs that are currently not being met. If the committee determines that there is a need for a CDC in Ellicott City, the committee may make recommendations to determine the geographic boundaries of the CDC, develop a mission statement for the CDC, outline the activities and scope of work for the CDC, determine how the CDC would interact with organizations currently operating in Ellicott City, outline a structure for the CDC, including staff and board positions, how the CDC would interact with county government and what organizations would be involved with the CDC, develop options for generating a steady stream of capital for the CDC, and develop a list of potential projects that could be benefited by involving the proposed CDC. Sounds like a business plan.
Right, but that's all may make recommendations.
Mhm.
So we could just make a recommendation that it be done and then
So
to get to all that detail before June 1st may be challenging.
So does it have a limitation? I don't hear a limitation.
No, I don't either.
Or it could be staged. You could make a recommendation and then follow up with more detail.
Only limited by our own restraint.
And I'd like to add that, you know, while we're having these conversations, when we're talking about board and staff, that we should also be talking about potential budgets. You know, they talk about grants and leveraging other resources, but, you know, I think taking what I heard Odette say about, and specifically in Montgomery County, what I'd like to take a closer look at that is that they have county invested CDOs, and at what level are they getting? What is the scope? What is the level of county involvement? You know, and really budget. You know, what is the budget? How small is that seed?
Is there,
you know?
you might not be able to answer this right now, so I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but is there money set aside in the $15.3 million for the potential of starting this organization?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
I
I
would-
don't know the
I
county's
wouldn't
budget,
think-
but
I-
boy, I'd
yeah.
be surprised if that was.
Every nickel's probably
Yeah.
taken.
Yeah. And to the, you know, for those of us who were there today to hear about how Courtney Watson and Katie Fryhester got a significant amount of money put back into the budget for flood mitigation, one of the things that Odette mentioned kind of briefly was this long-term goal of trying to get a community development fund started for Maryland. So within the Baltimore Beltway, there's a program that funds CDC's operating budgets there. At least it gives them a base level of funding. Within the DC Beltway there is as well. Outside of those two beltways, there is no operating funding available for CDOs in the state of Maryland. So if that's an issue, and funding for the Community Development Fund, which has been proposed many years now, is something that needs to be focused on. If we could have the Howard County, one of the recommendations would be that the Howard County delegation, support full funding for the Community Development Fund of Maryland, which has not previously been a priority for the Howard County delegation because they didn't have any CDOs to support. So there are some other sort of nuanced pieces that could be in there that could actually trigger significant funding. And actually other organizations that would fall under that could be some of the Main Street programs. So Main Street could benefit for themselves.
I have one other. I'm sorry. That's what happens when I miss, right? So looking at the unmet need list, I would submit some of these are probably met. Like there's. I'm guessing you guys just sort of started writing stuff down, and of course, you run out of time and whatever. But I would submit that maybe some of these things are like, there is some stuff sort of about, understanding what needs to be done to protect Ellicott City from storm damage. I don't know. I think you guys in the county are, Mark and his people and the engineering. That sounds to me like, you know what I mean. So there's probably a couple things on here that are resources at the state and local level. I guess they're unmet. They're always unmet, but a CDC doesn't fill that. That's just the nature of the beast. There's a shortage of funding for everybody, right?
Yeah,
Well,
I don't think this was specifically.
That
Sorry.
comment was
Go
about
ahead.
trying to find, if this entity were created, they would become expert in tapping those resources. We don't really have an entity out there now that is devoted, if I understood the comment correctly from last week, that's really devoted and focused on becoming an expert in how to apply, pursue, secure state and federal sources.
And that kind of built off something you said a couple weeks ago, where you're like, all this money is out there, why are we not applying for this?
Yeah.
Right? Well, there's no one to.
Well,
Right, that's exactly.
we certainly apply for a bunch of things, and
Yeah.
and they're tough, and we choose not to apply to things. As I'm sure everyone with nonprofit here at the table will attest. If it costs you $1,000 to get 500, you don't apply. So there are many sources. Unfortunately, some either require you to do certain things and you just think, well, we're not staffed to do, or that need doesn't exist in our jurisdiction, or the reporting requirements are so onerous that no organization could ever pull it off. So I do think that I would encourage us all to, while we can absolutely become even more expert and really focus like a laser on potential funding sources, there is no magical pot of money waiting for the right group to just run around with a big bag and catch.
Yeah, but there's things that ECP is just never going to apply for that you wouldn't.
Oh, absolutely.
Wouldn't even be
No,
on your
that's not
radar.
about us. There's absolutely, but I think that there are a lot of people who are applying for those things, and they're not. It's not quite as,
No, it's not.
you know,
It's
I
not,
mean, right?
it's not easy.
But-
No one's gonna write you a free check.
I'm thinking a networked, if this group gets networked the way I would hope it would get networked, it would just be aware of anything that's moving out there and would be, rifle shotting after everything in sight to try and grab as much, as we
And
possibly
nimble,
can.
yeah.
And have the ability, because they have a rap, they have a story they can lay out pretty quickly to say why we qualify for these things.
Also to be not reactive, but proactive, thinking 5, 10, 15 years down the road, where we should have 15 years ago. There were some efforts, but all of a sudden we're reacting. I would like to see an organization that has the ability to be proactive and start looking down the road, anticipating. So it's just a different process. It's not administrative.
It's not government.
It's
It's not something the government can do.
To answer the ultimate question, I'm inclined to believe that some organization would be useful in taking the ownership of these assets and developing them. I have two major concerns that give me hesitation on that ultimate question. The first one is a concern about bigfooting. This town has a created and evolved into a delicate ecosystem of various organizations that feed off of one another and benefit from one another. And however this organization comes into being, it is going to have to be worked into that ecosystem with finesse and delicacy. It cannot just come in and say, well, we're the big organization on campus now, and if you were doing it before, but we think it fits in our mission, we're doing it now. And I don't hear anyone saying that, but I do think there is a concern about mission creep, which is my personal concern. The second one is related to that, is that I would not want to recommend an organization that is mediocre at 100 tasks, as opposed to being really fantastic at a narrow set. And so I think that while Ellicott City's needs are legion, if this group has come to no other conclusion, it should be that. But should we recommend this creation, I would want us to err on the side of narrowness, simply because the organization, as it builds goodwill and as it builds credibility, then it's going to be able to do more, but it needs to really be amazing at a few set tasks first, especially in Ellicott City, which is a place that does not trust easy. And once it does, you got buy-in for life, but you need to build that trust first. So those are my major concerns, but you would ask the ultimate question of, let's answer first whether or not this organization is necessary. I think just by the very nature of having these assets, these properties that need to be owned by someone, and probably not the county, I think a CDC type organization could fit very well into that space. But those are my reservations.
I agree with you. I think it wants to be lean and mean.
Yeah, I think you're-
When you say the word organization, it scares me.
Mhm.
I think it's a powerful director who's aggressive and proactive and just becomes the champion. Yes, there's some staff, but it comes down to an individual. This is not an administrative position. This is a skill set. It's very special.
I knew we'd agree by the end, Gary.
And it comes down to the individual. That's a special individual.
Yes.
I think it's 4 or 5 years. Oh, I just wanted to say, I understand what you say about the delicate ecosystem, and what that reminds me of is a long time ago, I did more like capacity building work in watershed organizations up in Baltimore, and what we had was a whole lot of groups all working all with the same mission to protect the water and engage the community in restoration. And you had everybody competing for the same pot and a lot of duplication, and we're literally talking about a lot of stepping on toes inadvertently, but everybody with the same intent, to basically restore water and benefit the Chesapeake Bay. And what we saw and what we funded was a lot of consultants that had that expertise of working with communities to we actually saw like this consolidation of organizations, taking 2 separate organizations that can bring them together. And we funded, consultants to do that. People have backgrounds in organizational development, and they're able to kind of work out the administrative stuff and the bylaws and all that. So if they can do that and kind of put that landscape back to kind of break it apart and put it back together with good people, and now they're up and running and doing very successful. I feel like that could be a part of what our recommendations are. Is whatever this organization is, at some point we need to have some kind of forum or some kind of process to do just that and kind of ingratiate this CDO with the rest of the community, both partnership, government, everyone is it's going to be a partnership building piece. So, and they're going to need some help on how to do that. So that's just my 2 cents.
And I think Mike and Gary have mentioned on multiple occasions, like the notion of maybe their board be composed of members from different organizations. So that if we have that, and again, with we have the option to recommend board positions. So maybe we mandate that those organizations are represented, and it doesn't always have to be the same person, but someone coming from that organization.
Which has
on a
something to do
consistent basis.
with addressing the mission creep concern that Tom raised, because the other parties, that have missions, they've been defined, are at the table, and they help the organization stay in its area of expertise, so we don't have conflicts. Tim, you wanted to.
Yeah, first of all, just to answer to the basic question, I enthusiastically join the consensus that I'm hearing anyway, as far as the need for this. I actually came away from our meeting maybe 3 weeks ago. We had folks in the community here. I came away convinced that it sounded to me like there was a need. And I remember asking a specific question, I think it was to Beth, about like, what isn't there now that you really need, and could there be a place for this? So it sounded to me like there is a definite need that an entity like this could help to fill. So going back to Tom's comment about Mission Creek, I mean, when I look at this list of unmet needs, I mean, I'd want to be careful about how we talk about these things to manage expectations that if such an entity was to be recommended and created, that we're not promising the universe here that such an entity could address all of these things, and that gets to scoping the mission in terms of its real focus and emphasis and what it would really be about. The other thought I had is, I think it's natural, particularly after the announcements today, that we sort of gravitate a lot of our focus to these 6 or however many buildings there might be. But I want to be careful that we're not creating the impression that this is solely about property management.
Right.
And I go back to the name of community development and thinking about what that means in a kind of a
Also the
soft
boundary.
way. Pardon me?
And the boundary.
Well, there's that whole question too. And if we're to make this an entity that is attractive to those who would want to put money into it, do we define the scope of it so narrowly that it is seen as like, okay, this is a really risky area here? Or do we look at how we define the boundaries in a way that makes it attractive and potentially powerful, looking beyond the immediate sort of horizon? Because I think, we can talk and think in terms of like the time horizon for some of these proposed options for Main Street, but those are fairly short term, right? We're talking about 5 to 7 years in general, at least what was proposed today. But this enterprise would be something that would be around for a good long time in terms of promoting community development. So just thinking in terms of like getting beyond sort of the immediate crisis and looking beyond that in terms of how we would scope this. I'm sure we keep that in mind.
I agree, Tim. This list is very wide, broad. It's kind of a Christmas list, not to say Christmas is a thing, but it has a lot more than any organization can be expected to address. You can't solve affordable housing with one group in downtown Ellicott City. But there are things here I think we want to draw from as we think about crafting that mission statement. Maybe it being close to 8, I want to continue the conversation, but I probably can't put a motion up on the table. It's not the role of the chairperson, but if someone wanted to make a motion, to at least say whether we as a group agree we need to have a new group downtown, Ellicott City in the watershed area to help lead, oversee. I'd like to see if somebody wanted to make that motion, if we could take a vote tonight on that, and we can discuss it before we take the vote, but I feel like we're at a point with a half hour to go this evening, 35 minutes. It'd be good to know how we all feel. I have a sense of that, but I'd like to just ratify it.
Whether or not we
I
want
have
to
to-
create a CDC, you're saying? You didn't call it by name.
I'm not going to call it.
Well, I asked Brooke I asked Brooke to scrub this down because I wanted to see the language. And it says again, well, it does say CDC, which is whatever, but it says,
No big deal.
but it says examine the current if there's a need for community development. So that would be the motion. I mean, I would make that motion that the committee has found that there is a need for a community development corporation in Ellicott City.
All in favor?
Oh, really?
Say aye. All in favor?
Narrowly scope. Well, I would just caution us that, I have my hand up, narrowly scoped, but I would caution us that I think,
Well, but that's not the question.
That's not
part
the
of a
question right
vote.
now.
I don't think-
yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
But the question is there a need?
That's the question.
Right, the question is a need, not, we
So,
haven't
okay,
defined it or
how
done
would-
anything.
I would
Set
say,
up.
is there a need? I would like to put a footnote on that.
I heard it.
You're asking for a friendly amendment.
So, well,
Oh,
no,
friendly.
we're not, look, I thought we're not in Robert's rules, so. But I think, when I hear today and we talk about the buildings, we think, I'm actually, I'm a PhD in public policy, so actually government is a force for good, but I can understand not everybody wants government managing property, and in fact, the county government may say, we don't actually want to manage property. But I do think what we haven't necessarily, and we just haven't had time to do it, but there are plenty of not-for-profit organizations, government agencies, even for-profit businesses presumably, who actually serve some of the needs here, or some of the needs of the kind of organization that we may be thinking about, all of us collectively in different ways, theoretically, that we just haven't heard from, right? There may be some organizations that actually we wouldn't want to step on their toes because they may already be killing it in whatever their mission is, no matter how big or how small. And so I would just hate the idea of voting to create something and then later learning on, oh, sorry, you know, Voices for Children, like, we know you exist, but we forgot that you exist, and we're going to do part of your mission. And therefore fight for some of your funding, which doesn't help anybody. Or pick anybody, right? And we're thrilled, like, to, you know, Nick asked a couple weeks ago, well, Matt, do you guys want to be the, you know, we're not going to develop property. And we are not going to be a lending organization. That's not who we are. So thrilled if there's a need for that, and we're talking about these 4 to 6 buildings, someone's got to do it, and if the county's not going to do
4
it.
and 6 buildings.
Well, theoretically courthouse and whatever, but
Theoretically, it's the master plan, yes.
this group would, I mean, I don't think this group would take over the master plan, right?
It might implement it.
Right.
I think they'll be the force for moving it.
Okay.
I mean, the reason that Baltimore City, to be simplistic about it, the reason Baltimore City uses BDC, which is not a CDC but is quasi-government, is that it allows them to implement things much faster than government oftentimes can. So they're, I mean, you know, and that's similar with the EDA. So there's a way in which this could be utilized to implement things faster in the master plan than county government could do on their own. I think that that's probably one of the big benefits for county government, to be involved in this and to have a seat on the board and perhaps even charter it.
Yeah, and I'm all, what you bring up EDA every time. I just would hate for us to, like, in some way infringe or impinge or whatever the appropriate word is on what they're doing, right?
I think that would be part of the charge, and we should write that down. They should canvass the field, and it would begin to build that partnership that I hope comes out of this, that people start talking to each other.
Yeah. And they can't compete with the institutions that are there. I think they're there to help support those institutions and elevate everybody's game, because there's something we're all together on.
So did Main Street go through a similar process when they were stood up? I'm just curious, and that's a
Did-
leading question, but is it, like,
City
was,
Partnership.
yeah, ECP, sorry. When they went,
I'm going to go to Tom with the history.
So I was
Ed
not,
Lilly.
well, you were part of the, oh, Ed was,
Lilly.
yeah.
Sorry.
Well, it was
Not hide
the
now.
merging of two, it was the merging of two organizations, correct?
ECRF absorbed ECBA because they had the nonprofit.
right.
So that was,
I'm just talking about, like, making sure that you weren't overstepping on another organization and something that.
Well, I
well,
can
because
Well, we had
the
a much
two
more narrow
organizations
vision.
merged,
Right.
it was like we were meeting the needs of both of those organizations under one
One,
umbrella.
yeah.
And
So it wasn't,
we did have an instance, though, to what Matt was talking about, that this group should be aware of, where after the 2016 flood, other organizations sprung up as relief organizations. The Ellicott City Partnership, because it had expanded its scope and had expanded its service to constituents, had an even greater need for support from the county. Ultimately, what happened was, when the county budget came out, the funding that we would have otherwise received was split in two. And so, to Matt's point, and to everything we're doing here, I think that we're going to end up having that discussion about scope as we go forward, which is why I was comfortable saying, yes, I recommend creation of the CDC and fight on that hill when we get to it. And maybe it won't be a fight. But I am very sensitive and concerned that we not in any way encourage this new organization to get into those type of fights, because it would be nothing less than a tragedy for this organization to be created and then be the target of resources when it comes to Ellicott City, to the detriment. And I heard what you were saying about the ecosystem, but these are organizations, there is no surplus in Ellicott City as far as I'm concerned. There may be organizations that have some overlap, but there's a really good system working there right now. And if we set up an organization that diverts resources that may otherwise go to those missions and those organizations, I don't think we're doing a service to Main Street.
I don't think anybody would argue that.
Yeah.
I think anybody would.
Cool. I just want to make sure it was out there.
Promote everybody.
Yep.
but-
And I hope
right?
that-
Well, and I think property has to play, I mean, if you want a sustainable organization, it either has to have a fee-for-service component to it, or it has to have a property component to it. Because the existing organizations, I guess EcoWorks has a fee-for-service with government grants, but, and government work and things like that. But, and that makes you more sustainable because you're not constantly fighting for those small pots of money and not going into the county budget to try and compete against ECP.
Mhm.
And that absolutely has to be, and so that's why I do think the property component, if that can be worked out, can make it a much more sustainable,
It also becomes an incentive for that person.
To manage it well.
Organization, yeah, raising their salary, you know, they better be doing something.
but I think
It's
you're
not
right. I mean, I think that has to
administrative.
be clearly delineated in how this is established, that it's not to compete with existing resources. And I think it's also, I mean, and I don't know how you deal with this and all of this, but one of the sort of the travesties that I've learned through the process is how poorly funded the Main Street organizations are. And I would love to see, even if it's a secondary recommendation of, oh, by the way, we think ECP is doing great work and something needs to be fixed about this
Yeah,
too.
ultimately, the
You know,
CDC
I mean,
can be so
because-
successful that it can give grants to the
Sure.
partnership. I mean, sure.
And that's what we have to look at, that's what we have to look at, because you know what? There's no way we're gonna create an organization to perform any kind of missions or functions where we're gonna have exclusivity. It's just not gonna happen. But to be careful not to drain resources from other organizations
Right.
is what we need to focus on, like you said. But just like you said, Tom, I see the CDC being in a position to give grants to other organizations. I see the CDC being in the positions to direct people to those other organizations that do perform specific functions, whereas they might have come to us for those services because they thought that, oh, this is the CDC, I need to go to them. Well, we could direct them to ECP or any of the other organizations that are around, and we have to be partners with all of these other organizations. We're not going to be the big brother or big sister to them, but we want to be partners to them. We don't want to drain resources from them in any way. We want to support them. So that's what we have to keep in mind. We're not going to have exclusivity. There's no way we can do that.
Right, and not staff up, partner up.
Yes, yes.
You can help me, I'll pay you.
Let's not
Like-
lose
Yeah.
sight of the narrow monetary base we're creating here, because if it's 6 buildings, just think about that for a second. It's not a large portfolio of real estate. It's a fairly small, capital intensive, requires a lot of CapEx, capital expenditure to improve those spaces, to make them habitable, to share in the tenant's burden of opening a business up, which is what CDCs do regularly. So grants might be down the road. I don't want to mislead people. It's going to take a while to get to the point where the entity is creating a cash
Yeah.
flow where it can do anything more than cover its own expenses and the expenses of the consultants and other people that have to advise it. So, and
But that's
what-
better than competing with other organizations
Exactly, but it
for
kind
limited
of goes
grant
to where
awards.
Gary was going, that maybe it's more than just a 6-building footprint. I'm not saying we're here to talk about all these other assets, because I don't want to obligate the county or imply that there's an obligation for the county. But if other assets were brought to the table,
Right.
then you see a broader base from
And it
which
takes
you can
5
go.
and 10 years,
Time.
time. You know very
I
well
do.
how long it takes.
But I just want to caution on that point. It's a great point. We're not here to compete with the other entities that rely on government help.
And-
We're trying to create something that can self-sustain. So
Right.
that
That's
goes
the-
to my opening comments about we need an economic base, we need an asset base. The bigger the asset base, the better chance it is this thing's going to work.
As long as we don't position ourselves, as Tim said, as a real estate management entity.
Right.
Oh, I mean, we can't be one-dimensional.
Most, they aren't developers, they partner. They lease ground to others, they lease buildings to others. Developers, banks put their capital at risk. CDCs do some of that, but it's long-term leases. That's really the way that CDCs, many institutions like this, generate cash flow for themselves. And they maintain ownership. So if Howard County government decided that those 6 buildings for $1 to give them to the CDC, and the CDC manages them, the CDC creates a process by which developers compete for the right to redevelop those buildings, re-tenant the buildings. They pay a ground lease payment to the CDC, and that becomes the basis upon which the CDC supports itself. And eventually down the road, as more of these things happen, it's in the grant-making capacity. capacity so that it helps ECP and other organizations. Maybe I'm being a little utopian again, there I go, about how this could work. But to me, that's kind of a business model. To the comment earlier about the business plan, I can't remember who said that. Right here, Brooke. You know, it's kind of like, how does this thing work? Because it can't look to government to pay its bills.
Right.
Because then it is competing with Matt's group and other groups that are here. So, as I see this, I've got to find a way, craft a path where it can cash flow and not rely on state, local government. State and local government continues to support other things, not this thing.
But would it be appropriate though for the county to fund us with a certain amount of money just to get things done? Is that- Yeah, the seed, yeah.
No tree grows without a seed,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
Last
right.
time I checked.
Absolutely.
I mean, any fruit, vegetable I eat, there's a seed that somewhere is behind that. And we're gonna have to seed it a little bit.
It becomes a nonprofit organization. Right? It's a- or a non-
501c3.
Well, it will be, yeah. It's not a for-profit entity because it would cross that.
Angie has a burning question.
No, just touching on the seed, because this is something that I've been thinking about since Odette mentioned it, and, you know, one of the things that she said was, these organizations often grow out of something else. So I'm wondering, instead of us worrying about, or debating about whether or not the county's gonna front the money to seed the organization, is there, like, and going back to the EDA, is could it grow out of that?
Could grow, it probably,
And I'm only asking that because right
Okay.
now, let's say today we move forward, we're all in. We have no assets.
there's no office.
We're not entirely sure when they will be available. We have an ETA of when they'll be available.
So
Maybe
it's
before
kind of
that,
funny. that
And to top it all
So
off.
Howard County's already gone through this. It's not a perfect comparison, but it has a lot of parallels, and that's the Downtown Columbia Arts and Cultural Commission. It was created before it had any assets, before it was even sure that an asset would be transferred. And ultimately, its function is owning Meriwether Post Pavilion, which it received approximately, I don't know,
2 years,
6
4 years?
Yeah, years after it was created. And it then received the asset, and it's using the asset and revenue put off by the leasing of the asset to accomplish its mission.
Yeah, but didn't they also get an $80 million tip?
No. That was no. I have friends with the executive director, and it'd be fascinating to hear he got $8 million.
I'm sure he'll tweet about it.
No, they did not get the benefit of that. Rather, they had to. It was a requirement that Meriwether Post Pavilion be conveyed over to them, and you know they. I'm not going to get into their finances, but they do not have millions of dollars that they're sitting on. The function of this, I think, it is incumbent upon the CDC to create itself and get itself into a position where it can advocate for itself even before those assets are transferred over, because it needs the maturity and independence to make sure that it is receiving it on appropriate terms. We would not want this CDC to receive property that are encumbered in certain ways, that have environmental hazards, that have historical obligations that would outpace its capacity. You know, the organization will need to be able to stand on its own 2 feet.
Have you seen these buildings? They're full of lead, asbestos,
Mold.
yeah, mold.
Right, which is why the organization, as you know, infant-like as it may be, at the very least, you would want to have it set up and independent, in my opinion, before it negotiates for the acquisition of the property.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think what you were specifically asking though is Odette talked about how in almost in all cases they're started as perhaps even staff or another nonprofit will sponsor them until their 501c3 comes through
Right,
from
and
the
that's-
IRS.
Yes.
So
from
and
that-
CDN can serve that role. We have certainly served that role before for organizations around the state that were waiting to get their 501c3 and we're fundraising in advance of it. So you can have a fiscal sponsorship situation, and CDN probably would be a good one for that, just because of their statewide role and how effective they have been at standing them up before. But that's like a short term, like 6 to 8 month, maybe a year long. They kind of own it until then, and then once they get that official letter from the IRS, they come out ready to go. And it actually would be a good place for them to be, because then CDN gets to kind of nurture them through the process, and they've stood up, community development organizations before. So that could be an interesting way of establishing it.
But Tom makes an interesting point, because the buildings are compromised, as Matt knows probably better than anybody at the table here, with these challenges, be they structural, environmental, asbestos, mold, whatever it might be. Lead paint, I'll put, the devil's list of all bad
Guaranteed,
things,
yes.
the devil's list of all bad things you don't want to find in space. But maybe government steps up first and they remediate. And it's part of the program where they're stabilizing the buildings. They're kind of sure, it's a shell, it's a cold, dark shell. It's not really built out, but it's clean. It's ready for capital investment and tenancy. So again, that's part of the dialogue that we need to have in terms of what has just been, posited on the table today with the county exec, and then what will be played out the next month with these meetings that are going to happen. But maybe some of that gets taken care of and it's addressed, so that we're turning over an asset that has, it's got a pretty good clean bill of health. It may not be 100%, but it doesn't challenge the organization so much as that existing condition would today.
It's part of that public-private partnership. That's what's going on.
Yeah.
The public is taking over some of the state
Yeah. But could you imagine if that entity existed already?
already.
And the county was making its discussions today, and there was a joint press conference with the partnership present, with other organizations that play a role in that economic development thing, entity all playing a role together in unison, saying, we're here to make this happen. We all believe in this mission, this approach. We're giving you 5 choices. We're not picking a dog in this fight at all. We're just saying we're here to support whatever people feel most comfortable with.
The organization's part of that vision.
That's pretty cool. That would be
You
a
can't
win.
have one.
It doesn't, the way it's playing out is fine too. We need to catch up to it.
Need to catch up.
We gotta play a little catch up right now. So, 15 minutes to go. I'm not here to take every minute tonight, trust me. But we did reach a decision tonight, and sort of next steps to me, and let's discuss them, but maybe we can come back with an outline next week of some of these key points, and thanks for bringing the resolution up. Maybe I can sketch out, something and get it around before the meeting, so they're not looking at it cold next Wednesday night. If we can do it a couple days in advance, we'll do it. Get it out to everybody so that it sort of takes the framework of the resolution in terms of our responsibilities, and it just sort of starts laying
Right.
out the pieces. All right, so to Gary's point from day one, what is the watershed area? I think we need to define that. We'll put a definition for it, and we'll try to define the other things in terms of the mission. And I'm not here to sell anything. I don't have a dog in the fight. I really don't. I want the best result, but I really like to get consensus among all of us if it's feasible. We may not all get there. We may not all say 100% we can support where we're going to go, but I want to get as many of us as possible across the goal line, saying, with one voice, this is the county executive, the county council, the residents and the citizens and business owners. This is the vision we have, and we want them to embrace it as much as we're trying to embrace it. It won't work otherwise.
There's going to be a document or something prepared out of this. Is there a way for us to help with that?
Well,
Draft language for you?
I had an idea, and I've not talked to Odette, and I'm not here to say Odette would be the right person, but someone from that group that has a background, not with a specific CDC, but has this umbrella role that group plays. I mean, if we could get her to assist us, maybe in crafting the document, maybe we spend next week kind of putting the outline together of what we think the principles are. If we can get that done in an hour and a half, we may need 2 hours next week to do it. But if we can get that done, then it might be something we can give to somebody to sort of write.
Actually,
I don't think it's fair to say Shana has to do it because she has a lot of responsibilities. And I don't know that anybody around this table really has the expertise to articulate how best the CDC can
actually
work.
been part of a process where a group did a final report about an hour and a half. Just talked it through and cranking it out and reading it, because obviously this wants to be distilled. This doesn't want to be a tome, 400 pages.
Giraffe is a horse designed by the
Yeah. So I think about it next week, and if we're going to invite Odette back.
Well, how do
I
you feel about
just
that?
want to caution that, the report is supposed to be the consensus of this group. So
Okay.
to do an outline and then ask someone else to write the report is not necessarily reflective of
that
Right, this
guides
work.
that direction.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to throw it on the table. Obviously, we have not orchestrated this discussion. You can see a lot of evidence of that tonight. There's no behind the scenes, Mike's, Shana, they've got a plan, we don't have a plan. This
Well,
is a
we did
growth.
talk about how the report was going to get written. We had some preliminary
Yeah,
conversations
and
about that.
we did, and
Yeah.
you were pretty clear that you've got a lot on your plate, and we don't really have anybody else other than the members of this group that could write it and articulate it.
So, I have a thought. Given that we have all these bullet points, I think there's 7 of them sitting in front of us, do we want to create maybe subcommittees between now and June to maybe get together and each take on the topic and hash out our piece and then bring it back to the group?
Yeah, I mean, if there was something that if you did that and then there was a matter of like pulling it all together, like that's obviously something that I could do.
We want to talk.
I feel like they're also interconnected. It would be difficult for that to happen in subcommittee.
Yeah.
And then come back and say, well, we decided the scope was this, and then we learned that the geographic boundaries were X, and then your scope no longer matches the boundaries. So.
We're just
that-
going to stay on Main Street when we're talking about it.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah. Like, oh, well, we were thinking
I
about
think we could just
Baltimore County.
Go through that list at the table and just, come to.
And having just gone through this experience with the transition committee, I do think that we can get general sentiments that then someone amongst us,
Yeah.
we don't need to have paragraphs upon paragraphs. I think that many of these things can be accomplished by bullet points, and then to the extent they need to be expanded upon, I'm sure there's someone amongst us we would trust to do that and report it back to the committee. But I agree that we're going to want to do this as a group and do our best to be concise, but inclusive of where we're trying to go.
So
It
what if the
doesn't
whole-
mean that we can't go back to a specific topic and it needs fleshing out.
Right.
A few people who are.
So can the homework assignment for the next week be, everybody pull up the resolution and be prepared to walk from point 1 to point 7?
Nicole actually
Your
printed
thoughts?
out copies of the resolution for everybody.
Okay, great. And we can take that home and next week, and if it takes 2 weeks, it's 2 weeks, but we'll start next week.
And Judith's not going to be here next week?
No, I'll be here. May 1st, I have a conflict because I have to staff the county executive at Midfront.
Which might mean we could meet a different night that week to just keep moving along if necessary. So, people agree? Is that a good way to do it? Everyone has
I'm gonna
stock
have
and
to,
learning?
I'll send my feedback via email to the group.
Okay. Restaurant will still be open.
Indeed it will.
Anything else? Anyone else wants to cover? Any other subjects?
I'll take care of it.
Great. So 6-7 minutes to sit here. Thank you. We'll see you in a week. Good work tonight.
What?